April 12, 1943. Dawn broke over the Solomon Islands with a thin mist clinging to the water, obscuring the boundary between sea and sky. Aboard the small wooden patrol torpedo boat designated PT-109, Seaman First Class Leroy Jackson stood at his station, gazing into the fog with eyes trained by years of pre-dawn fishing trips off the coast of Louisiana. The American sailors believed they were hunting Japanese supply vessels. None imagined that within 24 hours, Jackson's humble fishing technique would send a destroyer to the bottom of the Pacific. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how naval warfare innovation sometimes comes not from admirals and engineers, but from ordinary men applying lifetime skills in extraordinary circumstances, and how one man's background, often dismissed or overlooked, would prove the decisive factor in a naval engagement that would change tactics throughout the Pacific theater. The Solomon Islands campaign had reached a critical phase by April 1943. American forces had secured Guadalcanal after 6 months of brutal fighting, but Japanese naval forces continued to dominate the waters around the Solomon Islands chain, particularly at night. The Tokyo Express, as Allied forces called it, continued to deliver troops, equipment, and supplies to Japanese garrisons on the northern islands under cover of darkness. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Jefferson Winston, commanding officer of PT-109, had received orders to patrol the Ferguson Passage, a narrow strait between the islands of New Georgia and Kolombangara. Intelligence reports indicated Japanese destroyers were using this route to deliver supplies to their forces. "Gentlemen, tonight we're looking for targets of opportunity," Winston briefed his crew of 11 men in the stifling heat of the wooden craft's tiny wardroom. Small barges, supply launches, maybe a patrol boat if we're lucky. Petty Officer Marcus Riley, the boat's executive officer, studied the map. "Sir, this passage is only 1,000 yards wide at points. If we encounter anything larger than ourselves, we'll use our superior speed and maneuverability," Winston interrupted, tapping his finger on the map. "Plus, we have the advantage of knowing these waters better than they do." In the back of the cramped space, Seaman Leroy Jackson listened quietly. At 32 years old, Jackson was older than most of his shipmates, including his 29-year-old commanding officer. The son of a commercial fisherman from Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, Jackson had spent his entire life on the water before enlisting in the Navy after Pearl Harbor. Unlike most of his white shipmates, Jackson had faced an uphill battle even to serve his country. The Navy of 1941 restricted African-American sailors primarily to steward's duties, cooking, cleaning, and serving officers. But the desperate need for experienced boatmen for the newly formed PT boat squadrons had opened a rare opportunity, and Jackson's extensive maritime experience had earned him a place aboard PT-109 despite the Navy's segregation policies. "Riley, you have the con until 1600 hours, Winston concluded. "Jackson, I want you on the bow watch. Your eyes are the best we've got in these conditions." "Yes, sir," Jackson replied, his Louisiana accent rolling the words together in a way that still sometimes drew sidelong glances from some of the northern sailors. As the meeting dispersed, machinist's mate, second class Walter Donahue, a stocky Bostonian with perpetually oil-stained hands, fell in alongside Jackson as they made their way back on deck. "So lucky," Donahue said, using the nickname the crew had given Jackson after he'd spotted a half-submerged log that would have damaged their propellers during their first patrol. "What's your gut telling you about tonight?" Jackson squinted at the horizon, where the morning sun was burning away the last of the mist. "Something big's coming. Barometer's falling, but not for a storm. I can feel it." Donahue laughed. "Your fisherman's almanac again? You and your superstitions." "Not superstition," Jackson replied evenly. "Observation. My daddy could tell you what was swimming under his boat just by how the water moved against the hull. 25 years on these waters, I learned to listen to what they're saying." The daytime hours passed with excruciating slowness, the wooden boat baking under the tropical sun as the crew made preparations for the night patrol. In the afternoon, Jackson sat in what little shade was available on the deck, working with a spool of wire and pliers. Lieutenant Junior Grade Frederick Carmichael, The boat's engineering officer and a former investment banker from Connecticut paused on his way past. "What are you working on, Jackson?" Jackson held up a length of wire formed into a peculiar loop with a twisted handle. "Wire trap, sir. Something my daddy taught me." "For catching fish?" Carmichael asked, bending to examine the simple device. "Yes, sir." "Though not in the way you might think," Jackson replied. "Down in the bayou, when you're going after certain fish in murky water, sometimes you need to feel for them rather than see them." Carmichael nodded politely, though his expression suggested he didn't fully understand. "Well, save the fishing for after we complete our mission, seaman." "Of course, sir," Jackson said, returning the wire to his pocket. As dusk approached, PT-109 took up its assigned patrol position near the southern entrance of Ferguson Passage. Two other PT boats, numbered 88 and 115, were positioned 5 miles to the north and south respectively, creating a loose screen across likely Japanese approach routes. The night was moonless, the sky partially cloudy, reducing visibility to less than 500 yards. Perfect conditions for the Tokyo Express, as they preferred to run without lights to avoid detection by Allied aircraft or patrol boats. By midnight, the crew of PT-109 was growing restless. 5 hours on station with no contact had frayed nerves already on edge. "Anything on radar?" Winston asked, stepping into the tiny chart house where radioman First Class Philip Morgan huddled over the primitive radar set that had been installed just 2 weeks earlier. "Nothing yet, sir," Morgan replied, adjusting a dial. "Wait, I might have something." He leaned closer to the screen, then straightened abruptly. "Contact bearing 045, range approximately 4,000 yards, moving southwest at approximately 20 knots. "Size estimate?" Winston asked sharply. Morgan shook his head. "Hard to tell, sir. Could be a large barge or a small patrol boat. The set isn't calibrated well for surface contacts yet." Winston stepped back onto the bridge and raised his binoculars. Jackson, eyes sharp to the northeast. "Already looking, sir," Jackson replied from his position on the bow. "There's something out there, but I can't make it out yet." The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. The patrol torpedo boat maintained its position, engines at idle, the sound of water lapping against the wooden hull the only noise in the darkness. "Sir," Jackson's voice came suddenly, low but urgent. "I see it, not a barge, much bigger." Winston raised his own binoculars again, straining to see through the darkness. Slowly, a shape began to materialize out of the night, a low, sleek profile moving through the water. "That's a destroyer," Winston breathed, lowering his glasses. "Fubuki class by the look of her," Riley added, his voice tight. Winston quickly assessed their situation. The Japanese destroyer displaced approximately 2,000 tons, carried 4 or 5 5-inch guns, and up to 9 24-inch torpedo tubes. PT-109, by contrast, was a wooden boat 78 feet long, displacing only 50 tons, armed with 4 torpedo tubes, 250 caliber machine guns and various smaller weapons mounted by the crew. "Radio silence," Winston ordered. "We'll track her and report her position once she's past us." "Sir," Jackson said, still focused on the Japanese warship, "she's changing course, heading directly for the passage." Winston considered their options. Attacking a destroyer with a PT boat was akin to a mosquito attacking an elephant. Possible, but extremely hazardous. "Sir," Riley whispered urgently, "if she gets through the passage, she could be delivering critical supplies to Kolombangara." Winston nodded grimly. "Battle stations. Prepare to attack." The crew moved with practiced efficiency to their combat positions. In the engine room, Donahue and his assistant brought the 3 Packard engines to life, their throaty rumble carefully muffled to avoid detection. "We'll approach from her port quarter," Winston instructed. "Launch torpedoes at 500 yards, then immediately turn to starboard at full speed. Gunners, prepare to provide covering fire if we're spotted." PT-109 began to move, gradually building speed as it angled toward an intercept course with the Japanese destroyer. "Range 1,000 yards, Morgan reported from the radar. "Sir," Jackson called from the bow, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Something's not right about her motion. She's moving oddly in the water." Winston frowned. "Explain." "She's riding too high, sir," Jackson replied, "and there's something trailing behind her." Winston raised his binoculars again, studying the destroyer's silhouette. After a moment, he lowered them with a puzzled expression. "She's towing something, possibly a barge or landing craft." This changed the tactical situation significantly. The destroyer would be less maneuverable while towing, but it also meant their target wasn't operating alone. "Maintain course," Winston ordered. "We'll still engage the destroyer first." As PT-109 closed the distance to 800 yards, disaster struck. A cloud that had been obscuring the scattered stars moved, and suddenly the PT boat was illuminated in faint starlight, its wake a phosphorescent trail pointing directly at the approaching torpedo boat. "They've seen us," Riley shouted, as a searchlight from the destroyer's bridge suddenly blazed to life, the beam sweeping across the water. "Full speed," Winston commanded, and PT-109 leaped forward, its wooden frame shuddering as the engines roared to maximum power. The searchlight found them, fixing PT-109 in its glare. Moments later, the destroyer's forward gun erupted, the 5-inch shell sending up a towering waterspout 30 yards off their starboard bow. "Return fire," Winston ordered, and the PT boat's 50-caliber machine guns began hammering, tracer rounds arcing toward the destroyer's bridge and searchlight. Over the radio came the voice of the commander of PT-88. "109, we've heard gunfire. What's your situation?" "Engaging Japanese destroyer in Ferguson Passage," Winston replied tersely. "Request assistance. 88 en route. ETA 12 minutes. Winston knew they wouldn't last 12 minutes against the destroyer's guns. "Prepare to launch torpedoes!" PT-109 had closed to 600 yards now, racing in a zigzag pattern as shells from the destroyer's main guns and smaller automatic weapons churned the water around them. "Torpedoes ready," called Torpedo Mate Second Class Edward Linney from his station. "Fire 1 and 2, Winston commanded. With a whoosh of compressed air, 2 Mark 8 torpedoes launched from their tubes, their wakes barely visible in the darkness as they sped toward the Japanese destroyer. "Hard to starboard," Winston ordered immediately, and PT-109 heeled sharply as it turned away from its target, the engines screaming as Donahue pushed them beyond their rated limits. All eyes watched for the telltale explosions that would indicate successful hits. Seconds passed, becoming a full minute. "No detonation," Riley reported grimly. "Both torpedoes missed." This was not uncommon. The Mark 8 torpedoes were notoriously unreliable, often running too deep or failing to detonate, even when they did strike a target. The Japanese destroyer, however, had not missed the significance of the attack. Its captain had ordered an immediate evasive maneuver, causing the vessel to veer sharply, and critically, causing problems with whatever it was towing. "Sir," Jackson called from his position, "the tow line has snapped. The barge is drifting free." Winston made a split-second decision. "Bring us about. We'll engage the barge." "Sir?" Riley questioned, even as he relayed the order to the helm. "That barge contains something important enough that they assigned a destroyer to tow it," Winston explained rapidly. "Could be fuel, ammunition, critical supplies. Either way, it's a legitimate target." PT-109 swung around in a tight circle, the wooden boat's hull creaking under the strain. The Japanese destroyer, meanwhile, had also changed course and was attempting to recover its tow, its searchlight now focused on the drifting barge rather than the American torpedo boat. "They're distracted," Winston observed. "This is our chance. Bring us alongside that barge. Gunners prepare to strafe it. If it's carrying fuel or ammunition, a few incendiary rounds should do the trick." As they approached the barge, now illuminated by the destroyer's searchlight about 400 yards away, Jackson studied it intently from his position on the bow. "Sir," he called back to Winston, "that's not a barge. It's some kind of submersible vessel." Winston raised his binoculars in surprise. What he saw confirmed Jackson's assessment. The vessel was approximately 60 feet long, with a conning tower visible amidships. It wasn't a full-size submarine, but rather some kind of midget submarine or large submersible transport. "Change of plans," Winston announced. "We're going to board that vessel." "Board it?" Riley asked incredulously. "Intelligence would give their eye teeth to examine a Japanese submersible," Winston replied firmly, "especially one being delivered with such valuable escort." It was a daring plan, bordering on foolhardy, but Winston recognized the rare opportunity presented. The Japanese destroyer, having lost its tow, was now maneuvering to recover it, temporarily creating a gap between the two vessels. "Jackson, Donahue, Linney, prepare to board," Winston ordered. "Riley, you'll maintain command of the boat while I lead the boarding party." The three named sailors quickly gathered what weapons they could, pistols and knives primarily, as they needed to keep their hands free for climbing. PT-109 slowed as it approached the drifting submersible, coming alongside with barely a bump. In the distance, the destroyer was turning, its searchlight still sweeping the water. "We have maybe 3 minutes before that destroyer is in position to fire on us again," Winston told the boarding party. "Move fast, gather whatever intelligence materials you can find, and get back aboard." Jackson was the first over the side, landing lightly on the metal deck of the submersible. The vessel rode low in the water, suggesting it was fully loaded. The hatch to the conning tower stood partially open. "It's unmanned, sir," Jackson reported as Winston and the others joined him. "Appears to be under remote control from the destroyer." Winston's eyes widened at the implications. A remotely operated submarine transport. That's significant technology. The group quickly moved to the conning tower. Winston and Donahue descended through the hatch, while Jackson and Linney remained on deck as lookouts. Inside, Winston found not the expected cargo of supplies, but something far more alarming: row upon row of cylindrical objects secured to the bulkheads. "Mines," Donahue whispered, his flashlight beam playing across the deadly cargo. "Must be 30 or 40 of them." Winston nodded grimly. "They're planning to mine the approaches to our anchorage at Tulagi. This submersible would allow them to place the minefield without being detected." The tactical situation suddenly became clear. If the Japanese succeeded in mining the waters around Tulagi, American naval operations in the Solomons would be severely hampered. Ships would be lost, and clearing the minefield would require resources they couldn't spare from other operations. "Sir!" Linney's voice came urgently from above. "Destroyers coming about! Range 800 yards and closing!" "Grab whatever documentation you can find," Winston ordered Donahue. "We need to move." As the men searched frantically for plans or codebooks, Jackson appeared at the hatch. "Sir, I have an idea," he said, his voice calm despite the urgency of their situation. "Make it quick, Jackson," Winston replied, gathering what appeared to be a codebook from a small desk. "These mines," Jackson said, "they're magnetic, correct?" Donahue examined one closely. "Yes. Designed to be triggered by a ship's magnetic field." "Then they're armed already," Jackson continued, "ready to detonate when they sense a large enough metal mass." Winston saw immediately where Jackson was headed. "The destroyer," Jackson nodded. "If we could somehow get this submersible between the destroyer and ourselves, the mines would trigger." Winston finished the thought. "But how do we move it? There's no time to figure out the remote control system." Jackson reached into his pocket and pulled out the wire loop he had been working on earlier. "With this, sir." Winston stared at the simple device. "Explain." "In the bayou, when we needed to move alligators without getting too close, we'd use wire loops like this," Jackson explained rapidly. "If we can snag the destroyer's broken tow cable that's still attached to this vessel, we can use our boat to pull the submersible into position." It was an audacious plan, but with the destroyer now less than 600 yards away and closing rapidly, they had few options. "Do it," Winston ordered. "Donahue, help me gather these documents. Linney, back to the boat and prepare to move on my order." As Donahue and Winston collected what intelligence materials they could find, Jackson climbed back on deck and moved to the bow of the submersible. The broken tow cable that had connected it to the destroyer trailed in the water ahead of the vessel. With the skill born of years of practice in Louisiana's swamps and bayous, Jackson manipulated his wire loop, extending it on the end of a boat hook that he had quickly retrieved from PT-109. He worked the loop into position around the heavy cable, then twisted the handle to tighten it. "Got it," he called back. Winston and Donahue emerged from the conning tower, their arms full of documents and what appeared to be a crude remote control device. "Back to the boat," Winston ordered. "Jackson, bring that cable with you." As the men clambered back aboard PT-109, the Japanese destroyer was now clearly visible, its outline sharp against the night sky as it approached at high speed, its forward gun trained on them. "Jackson, secure that cable to our stern cleat," Winston commanded as he returned to the bridge. Donahue, give me everything the engines have got. The submersible is too heavy for us to tow at speed, sir, Riley objected. We're not towing it, Winston replied grimly. We're positioning it. Jackson, explain your thinking to Mr. Riley while I radio our situation. As Winston grabbed the radio handset, Jackson quickly outlined his plan to the executive officer. The destroyer will be following us, Jackson explained. If we maneuver correctly, we can position ourselves so that the submersible is between us and the destroyer. When the destroyer passes over or near enough to the submersible, the magnetic mines detonate, Riley finished, his eyes widening. It's brilliant and insane in equal measure. The plan relied on precise timing and maneuvering, and more than a little luck. With the cable secured, PT-109 began to move forward slowly, dragging the submersible behind it at an angle calculated to place it in the destroyer's path. The Japanese warship, now fully aware of both the American torpedo boat and its lost submersible, increased speed to attack range. Its forward gun fired again, the shell landing 50 yards astern of PT-109, closer than before. They're finding our range, Riley observed tensely. Just a little longer, Winston replied, his hands steady on the controls as he guided PT-109 in a careful arc, dragging the submersible into position. Jackson, when I give the word, cut the cable. Jackson nodded, a knife ready in his hand as he crouched by the stern cleat where the wire loop held the submersible's tow cable. The Japanese destroyer was now 500 yards away and closing rapidly, its guns firing continuously. Shells splashed around PT-109, the margin of error shrinking with each salvo. A few more seconds, Winston murmured, his eyes fixed on the destroyer's approach angle. PT-109 continued its arc, dragging the submersible into a position directly between it and the oncoming destroyer. The distance had closed to 400 yards. Now! Winston shouted. Jackson's knife flashed in the darkness, severing the connection between PT-109 and the captured submersible. Immediately, Winston ordered, full speed ahead, all engines maximum power. PT-109 leaped forward, freed from its burden, accelerating away from both the submersible and the Japanese destroyer. Behind them, the submersible drifted, nearly invisible in the darkness, except to those who knew precisely where to look. The Japanese destroyer, focused on pursuing the fleeing American torpedo boat, maintained its course, a course that would take it directly over or extremely close to the drifting submersible laden with armed magnetic mines. All hands brace for explosion, Winston ordered as PT-109 raced away from the scene. The seconds stretched into an eternity as the crew of PT-109 waited, their boat putting as much distance as possible between themselves and what they hoped would be the site of an imminent detonation. Then it happened, not a single explosion, but a rapid series of them, each building upon the last as mine after mine detonated in a chain reaction. The night sky lit up with an orange glow as the first explosion triggered others, the submersible's entire cargo of magnetic mines detonating either from the initial blast or from proximity to the Japanese destroyer's hull. Through binoculars, the crew of PT-109 watched in awe as the Japanese destroyer, caught in the center of the explosions, was lifted partially out of the water by the force of the blasts. Its midsection appeared to buckle almost immediately, secondary explosions erupting along its length as its own ammunition magazines and fuel tanks ignited. "My God," Riley whispered as the destroyer broke apart, its back broken by the combined force of dozens of mines exploding simultaneously beneath it. Within minutes, the once proud Japanese warship had disappeared beneath the waters of Ferguson Passage, leaving only scattered debris floating on the surface and a film of oil spreading outward. As dawn approached, PT-109 rendezvoused with PT boats 88 and 115, which had arrived too late for the engagement, but just in time to witness its aftermath. "You're telling me you sank a Japanese destroyer with a wire loop?" Lieutenant Harrison, commander of PT-88, asked incredulously as Winston concluded his report. "Not me," Winston replied, placing his hand on Jackson's shoulder. "Seaman Jackson here. His background as a Louisiana fisherman gave us the tool and the technique we needed at the critical moment." Jackson stood straighter under the recognition, though his expression remained solemn. "Just applied what my daddy taught me, sir. Sometimes you don't need fancy equipment to solve a problem. Sometimes the simplest tool is the right one." Lieutenant Harrison shook his head in amazement. "Well, whatever it was, naval intelligence is going to want every detail, and those documents you recovered from the submersible could be invaluable." As the PT boats turned toward their base at Tulagi Harbor, the rising sun illuminated the scattered debris that marked the final resting place of the Japanese destroyer and its secret mine-laying submersible. Winston approached Jackson, who stood alone at the bow, looking out over the water. "Your quick thinking saved this boat and its crew," Winston said quietly. "Just did what needed doing." "Sir," Jackson replied. "You did more than that," Winston insisted. "You proved something important tonight." Jackson turned to face his commanding officer, a question in his eyes. "You proved that the Navy's segregation policies are not just morally wrong, they're tactically foolish," Winston continued. "If you hadn't been on this boat, if your experience and background hadn't been available to us at that critical moment, we'd likely all be dead, and that mine-laying operation would have proceeded unchecked." Jackson was silent for a long moment before responding. "My daddy always said the sea doesn't care what color you are. It'll drown you just the same if you don't respect it." "Your father sounds like a wise man," Winston replied. "He was, sir." As PT-109 continued toward Tulagi Harbor, the crew began to process what they had just experienced. A Japanese destroyer, one of the most formidable surface combatants in the Pacific theater, had been sunk not by torpedoes or naval gunfire, but by a simple wire loop and the knowledge of a fisherman from Louisiana who had been allowed to serve his country only because of wartime necessity. The news of PT-109's remarkable encounter spread quickly through the American naval forces in the Solomon Islands. By the time the 3 patrol torpedo boats arrived at the Tulagi Harbor base, word had already reached Commander Thomas Warder, the squadron commander for Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 5. Warder, a career naval officer with 20 years of service, waited at the dock as the boats approached. Beside him stood Lieutenant Commander Alan Radford from Naval Intelligence, who had flown in from Guadalcanal specifically to debrief the crew of PT-109 about their engagement and the documents they had recovered from the Japanese submersible. "They're saying Winston's crew sank a destroyer," Radford remarked skeptically as the boats came into view. "With what? These boats carry 4 torpedoes at most, and the Mark 8s have been nothing but trouble." "That's what I intend to find out," Warder replied, his weathered face betraying nothing of his thoughts. As PT-109 tied up to the dock, the exhausted crew began to disembark. Winston approached the waiting officers and saluted. "Commander Warder, Lieutenant Commander Radford," he acknowledged. "I wasn't expecting such a welcoming committee. When we receive reports that one of our PT boats has sunk a Japanese destroyer, it tends to attract attention," Warder replied dryly, "particularly when the report mentions unconventional tactics." "Yes, sir," Winston nodded. "Everything's in my preliminary report, but the short version is that we encountered a Japanese destroyer towing what turned out to be a mine-laying submersible. Through a series of events, we were able to use the mines on that submersible against the destroyer itself." Radford stepped forward. "And the documents you recovered?" Winston turned and beckoned to Donahue, who approached carrying a waterproof bag. "Everything we could gather in the time available, sir. Codebooks, technical manuals, what appears to be operational orders." Radford took the bag eagerly. "This could be invaluable, Lieutenant. Who was responsible for the tactical innovation that led to the sinking?" Winston turned and gestured to Jackson, who stood at a respectful distance. "Seaman First Class Leroy Jackson, sir. His idea, his execution." Warder and Radford exchanged a glance, their surprise evident as they took in Jackson's dark complexion. In 1943, even in the midst of a global conflict, the United States Navy remained largely segregated, with African-American sailors typically restricted to support roles. "Approach, Seaman Jackson," Warder ordered. Jackson stepped forward and saluted crisply. "Sir, Lieutenant Winston credits you with the idea that sank the Japanese destroyer. Explain what happened." "In your own words." Jackson stood at attention, his voice steady as he recounted the events of the previous night, from the initial detection of the destroyer to the improvisation with the wire loop and the strategic positioning of the mine-laden submersible. As he finished his account, Radford shook his head in amazement. A wire loop, the kind used for fishing in Louisiana bayous, and that brought down a 2,000-ton warship. "Necessity breeds innovation, sir," Jackson replied simply. "Indeed it does," Warder said thoughtfully. "Very well. Lieutenant Winston, have your crew ready for a full debriefing at 0800 hours tomorrow. Seaman Jackson, you will attend as well." "Yes, sir," both men replied in unison. As the officers departed, Winston turned to his crew. "You heard the commander. Get some rest, all of you. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." The crew dispersed, heading toward their quarters, but Jackson lingered behind. Winston noticed his hesitation. "Something on your mind, Jackson?" "Sir, I was wondering about the Japanese sailors from the destroyer." Winston's expression sobered. The explosion was catastrophic. Between the mines and their own ammunition cooking off, it's unlikely there were many survivors, if any. Jackson nodded slowly. "I understand, sir. It's just different, knowing you've had a direct hand in something like that." Winston placed a hand on Jackson's shoulder. "That's the burden we all carry, Jackson. We do what we must to protect our own and defeat the enemy. But we never forget the human cost." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." As Jackson walked away, Winston watched him go, struck by the fisherman's depth of character. In that moment, he made a decision that would have repercussions far beyond what he could imagine. The following morning, the debriefing took place in a secure Quonset hut that served as the squadron's operations center. Present were Commander Warder, Lieutenant Commander Radford, and several other intelligence officers. The entire crew of PT-109 sat at long tables, with Winston at the head and Jackson positioned prominently beside him, an arrangement that raised eyebrows among some of the officers present. For 4 hours, the crew recounted every detail of the encounter, prompted by specific questions from Radford and his team. Particular attention was paid to the Japanese submersible and its mine-laying capabilities. "Based on the documents you recovered," Radford explained, "this was a Type 3 submersible transport, modified to deploy magnetic mines. The Japanese were planning to mine the approaches to our anchorages throughout the Solomons. If they had succeeded, we could have lost dozens of ships before even realizing what was happening. So one patrol effectively prevented a major threat to our naval operations in this theater," Warder observed. "Precisely," Radford confirmed. "Which brings me to my next point." He turned his attention directly to Jackson. "Seaman Jackson, your innovative thinking quite literally changed the course of naval operations in this region. The fact that you were able to adapt your civilian experience as a fisherman to a combat situation speaks to both your quick thinking and your deep understanding of maritime environments." Jackson shifted uncomfortably under the praise. "Thank you, sir. But any sailor worth his salt uses what he knows when the situation calls for it." "Perhaps," Radford replied, "but not every sailor has the breadth of experience you brought to that moment, which is why I've recommended you for recognition." Winston leaned forward, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had made his own recommendation the night before, but had kept it to himself. "Sir?" Jackson asked, clearly surprised. Commander Warder stood, his expression serious. "Seaman First Class Leroy Jackson, in recognition of your actions during the night of April 12th to 13th, you are to receive the Silver Star for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States." A murmur ran through the room. The Silver Star was the third highest military decoration for valor in combat. For an African-American sailor to receive such recognition in 1943 was nearly unprecedented. "Additionally," Warder continued, "based on Lieutenant Winston's recommendation and your demonstrated abilities, you are being promoted to Petty Officer 3rd Class, effective immediately." The room fell silent. Jackson sat motionless, momentarily unable to comprehend what he was hearing. "Sir," he finally managed, "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything, Petty Officer Jackson," Warder replied, emphasizing the new rank. "Your actions have spoken for you." As the debriefing concluded, Winston approached Jackson outside the Quonset hut. "Congratulations, Petty Officer," he said with genuine warmth. "Thank you, sir," Jackson replied. still appearing somewhat dazed by the turn of events. Though I have to admit, I never expected anything like this. You earned it, Winston assured him. But I should warn you, things aren't going to be easy. Not everyone will accept this change willingly. Jackson's expression sobered. I'm aware of that, sir. I've been aware of it my entire life. Nevertheless, Winston continued, what happened out there in Ferguson Passage is going to have ripple effects far beyond just our boat or even this squadron. You've demonstrated something important, Jackson, that artificial barriers like segregation don't just harm those they're imposed upon. They harm the entire service by limiting the full utilization of talent. I just did my job, sir, Jackson replied modestly. And in doing so, you may have begun to change minds, Winston said. Speaking of which, there's something else you should know. Naval intelligence is very interested in your wire loop technique. Jackson looked surprised. My loop? It's just a simple tool, sir. Any fisherman from the Gulf Coast would know it. Perhaps, but no one has thought to apply it in quite the way you did. Radford wants you to demonstrate the technique for a group of PT boat crews next week. They're calling it the Jackson Method. For the first time since Jackson had come aboard PT 109 months earlier, Winston saw the reserved fisherman look genuinely embarrassed. Sir, there's nothing special about what I did, Jackson protested. That's where you're wrong, Winston replied firmly. Innovation often comes from applying ordinary knowledge in extraordinary circumstances. That's what you did, and that's what could save more lives going forward. 3 days later, the formal award ceremony took place on the deck of the USS Jamestown, a seaplane tender that served as the temporary flagship for naval forces in the area. Rear Admiral Timothy Halloran had flown in specifically to present the Silver Star, an indication of how seriously the High Command viewed the prevention of the Japanese mine-laying operation. The crew of PT 109 stood at attention in their best uniforms, with Jackson at their center. Behind them, arranged in formation, were the crews of the other PT boats stationed at Tulagi. The audience also included war correspondents, their presence ensuring that the story would reach newspapers back home. Admiral Halloran, a tall man with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent his life at sea, addressed the assembled sailors. The nature of war often revolves around massive forces, fleets, armies, air wings, clashing in titanic struggles, he began. But history teaches us that sometimes the most consequential actions come from small units, even individual sailors, applying creativity and determination at crucial moments. He turned to face Jackson directly. Petty Officer Jackson, your actions on the night of April 12th embodied the finest traditions of naval service. Faced with a superior enemy force, you drew upon your lifetime of experience to devise a solution that not only saved your boat and crewmates, but eliminated a significant threat to Allied operations in this theater. The Admiral lifted the Silver Star Medal from its case. For gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States, it is my honor to present you with the Silver Star. As he pinned the medal to Jackson's uniform, flashbulbs popped from the war correspondent's cameras. Jackson stood rigidly at attention, his expression a careful mask that revealed nothing of the complex emotions surely churning within him. Thank you, sir, he said simply when the Admiral stepped back. Do you have anything you'd like to say, Petty Officer? Halloran asked. Jackson hesitated, then spoke in a clear voice that carried across the deck. Only that I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve my country, sir, and that I share this honor with every member of PT 109's crew. What happened that night wasn't the work of any one sailor, but of all of us working together. Admiral Halloran nodded approvingly. Well said, Petty Officer. Unity of purpose and diversity of thought, that is what makes our Navy strong. The ceremony concluded, but its impact was just beginning. The following day, several newspapers in the United States carried the story, complete with photographs of Jackson receiving his medal. The headlines varied from paper to paper: Louisiana fisherman's trick sinks Japanese destroyer, Navy man uses bayou skills to defeat enemy warship, PT boat crew's ingenuity prevents major naval threat. Only a few publications, primarily African-American newspapers like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier, specifically highlighted Jackson's race in their coverage. Negro sailor awarded Silver Star for heroism in Pacific. Black fisherman's knowledge proves decisive in naval battle. The story resonated across the country, not just for its tale of underdog triumph, but because it represented something many Americans were beginning to recognize. The war effort required the contributions of all citizens, regardless of background. In the weeks following the ceremony, Jackson found himself unexpectedly in the role of instructor. As Winston had mentioned, naval intelligence had indeed taken an interest in his improvised technique. PT boat crews from throughout the Solomon Islands were cycled through Tulagi to receive training in what was now officially termed alternative vessel interdiction techniques. Jackson, still uncomfortable with the attention, nevertheless took to teaching with natural skill. He demonstrated how to create various types of wire loops for different purposes, how to deploy them from a moving vessel, and how to secure tow lines quickly under adverse conditions. The key isn't the tool itself, he explained to a group of PT boat sailors one humid afternoon. It's understanding how to use what you have available to solve the problem in front of you. The sea doesn't care about fancy equipment. It respects knowledge and adaptability. Commander Warder, observing from a distance, remarked to Winston, "He's a natural teacher." "He is," Winston agreed, "and the men respect him despite." He left the sentence unfinished, but Warder understood. "Because of what he did," Warder completed the thought, "results tend to overcome prejudice, at least in wartime." "Let's hope that lesson outlasts the conflict," Winston replied. By the end of May 1943, PT-109 was back on regular patrol duties. The Japanese, having lost their specialized mine-laying submersible and the destroyer escorting it, had apparently abandoned that particular strategy. Instead, they had intensified their conventional barge traffic, attempting to resupply their garrisons on the northern Solomon Islands through more traditional means. On the night of May 27th, PT-109 was patrolling off the coast of New Georgia when radar contact was made with what appeared to be a small convoy of barges. 3 distinct contacts, Morgan reported from the radar station, ranged 3,000 yards bearing 350, speed approximately 8 knots. Supply barges, Winston concluded, perfect targets, battle stations. The crew moved to their positions with practiced efficiency. Jackson, now wearing the insignia of a petty officer, took his usual position on the bow, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. "Sir," he called back to Winston, "something's odd about their formation. They're too precisely spaced." Winston frowned. "Elaborate. Japanese barge convoys are usually clustered tightly together for mutual protection," Jackson explained. "These are spaced evenly, about 200 yards apart, moving in a perfect line." Winston considered this information. Since the destruction of the destroyer and submersible, intelligence had warned of possible Japanese adaptations to their supply methods. Could this be one such adaptation? "Recommendations?" he asked, valuing Jackson's insight. "Approach with caution, sir. Observe before engaging." Winston nodded. "Agreed. Helmsman, bring us to bearing 345. We'll parallel their course at 1,000 yards and observe." PT-109 adjusted course, maintaining a parallel track to the suspected barge convoy, but keeping enough distance to avoid detection. The night was clear, with a quarter moon providing just enough illumination to make out shapes on the water without revealing the PT boat's own position. After several minutes of observation, Jackson spoke again. "Sir, the lead vessel is larger than a standard barge, and there's something unusual about its wake pattern." Winston raised his binoculars, studying the lead vessel carefully. "You're right. That's not a barge. It's a small patrol craft, possibly armed." "And the others?" Riley asked from beside him. "Still look like barges, but—" Winston trailed off, focusing his binoculars more intently. "Wait, the last vessel has an unusual profile too, different from the patrol craft, but definitely not a standard barge." Jackson had moved to the starboard machine gun position for a better vantage point. "Sir, I think I know what they're doing. The first vessel is a patrol boat serving as escort. The middle vessel is indeed a supply barge, but that last vessel, I believe it's a fuel barge, but modified to serve as a floating gun platform." Winston lowered his binoculars. "A trap. They're using the supply barge as bait with firepower fore and aft to catch any PT boats that attack." "Exactly, sir," Jackson confirmed. "After what happened with the destroyer, they're adapting their tactics." Winston smiled grimly. "Then we'll adapt ours as well. Here's what we're going to do." He quickly outlined a plan that would use the Japanese' own tactical adaptation against them. Instead of attacking the convoy directly, PT-109 would approach from astern, targeting the disguised gun platform first, before it could bring its weapons to bear on them. "We'll use torpedoes on the gun platform," Winston explained. "Then strafe the patrol boat from long range to disrupt their ability to coordinate. Only then will we approach the supply barge itself." The plan was executed with precision. PT-109 accelerated suddenly, coming around behind the trailing vessel before the Japanese convoy realized they were under attack. 2 torpedoes were launched at 800 yards, both striking the disguised gun platform amidships. The vessel erupted in flames, illuminating the night scene. The patrol boat at the head of the convoy immediately began to turn, but found itself caught in an impossible tactical situation. It had been positioned to defend against attacks from the front or sides, not from the rear. As it attempted to come about, PT-109's 50-caliber machine guns opened fire, sweeping its bridge and disrupting any attempt at coordinated defense. With both escort vessels neutralized, PT-109 approached the supply barge, which was now attempting to flee toward the shore of New Georgia. A few well-placed rounds into its engines brought it to a halt. "Prepare a boarding party," Winston ordered. "Let's see what they're carrying." Jackson, along with Donahue and 2 other sailors, boarded the barge, while the rest of PT-109's crew maintained a vigilant watch for any additional Japanese vessels that might respond to the engagement. "Rice, ammunition, medical supplies," Jackson reported after a quick survey of the barge's cargo. "Standard resupply materials for a garrison. Nothing unusual or strategic." Winston nodded. "Place the demolition charges. We'll sink it in place." As the boarding party returned to PT-109, Jackson paused at the rail, looking back at the burning gun platform and the disabled patrol boat. "They changed their tactics because of what we did," he observed to Winston, "and we changed ours in response." "That's like a conversation of sorts." "That's an insightful way to think about it," Winston replied. "Warfare is indeed a dialogue, albeit a violent one. Each side responds to the other's innovations, forcing continuous adaptation." "Makes me wonder what they'll try next," Jackson said as the demolition charges detonated, sending the supply barge to the bottom. "Whatever it is, we'll be ready," Winston assured him, "because we have something they don't." "What's that, sir?" Winston smiled. "People like you, Jackson. People who see the world differently and bring unique perspectives to the fight." As June 1943 arrived, the strategic situation in the Solomon Islands began to shift. American forces were preparing for Operation Toenails, the invasion of New Georgia, scheduled to begin on June 30th. In preparation, PT boat activity increased dramatically, with nightly patrols seeking to interdict Japanese supplies and reinforcements. PT-109 continued its operations, now with a growing reputation throughout the PT boat squadrons. The Jackson method, as it had become known, had been adapted and modified by various crews to suit different tactical situations. Wire loops of various designs had become standard equipment on PT boats throughout the theater, used not just for the dramatic purpose that had made them famous, but for more mundane but essential tasks like clearing debris from propellers or securing tow lines to disabled craft. On June 10th, PT-109 received new orders. The boat and its crew were being temporarily reassigned to a special task force that would operate north of New Georgia, directly in the path of expected Japanese naval movements preceding the American invasion. "We'll be operating alongside PT boats from Squadron 3, Winston informed his crew during the pre-mission briefing. "Our specific assignment is to locate and identify Japanese naval vessels moving through the Blackett Strait." "Identification only, sir?" Riley asked. "Not engagement?" "Correct," Winston confirmed. "This is primarily an intelligence-gathering operation. High Command needs accurate information on Japanese naval deployments before committing to the invasion." Jackson, now fully integrated into the boat's leadership structure, despite his relatively junior rank, studied the chart of the operational area. "Sir, the Blackett Strait narrows considerably here," he said, indicating a point on the map. Any vessel passing through that section would be easily observable from this small island. Winston examined the location Jackson had indicated. Vila Island. Good observation. That might make an excellent observation post. With your permission, sir, Jackson continued, I'd like to recommend we establish a shore observation post rather than keeping the boat on station continuously. We could maintain radio contact while the PT boat itself remains hidden, reducing our risk of detection. Winston considered the suggestion. It has merit. Who would you recommend for the shore party? Myself, sir, along with Radioman Morgan for communications, Jackson replied without hesitation. Very well, Winston agreed. We'll establish the observation post tomorrow night. The following evening, PT-109 approached Vila Island under cover of darkness. The small, uninhabited island was densely forested down to the shoreline, providing excellent concealment for both the boat and the planned observation post. Jackson and Morgan went ashore with minimal equipment, a portable radio, binoculars, 3 days of rations, and their sidearms. Their position, carefully selected on the island's northern tip, provided an unobstructed view of the narrowest section of the Blackett Strait. We'll return in 72 hours, Winston told them as they prepared to depart. Maintain radio silence except to report significant Japanese naval movements. If you observe major force deployments, break silence immediately. Understood, sir, Jackson replied. We'll be fine. As PT-109 disappeared into the darkness, Jackson and Morgan established their observation post, camouflaging their position with local vegetation and setting up a rotation for continuous observation. I never thought I'd find myself on a deserted island in the middle of the Solomon Sea with a fisherman from Louisiana, Morgan remarked as they settled in for their watch. Jackson smiled slightly. Life takes unexpected turns, especially in wartime. You can say that again, Morgan agreed. 8 months ago I was a radio operator at a commercial station in Minneapolis. Now I'm hiding in the bushes watching for Japanese warships. And I was bringing in catches of redfish and shrimp with my father and brothers, Jackson added. Now I'm a petty officer with a silver star. Morgan was quiet for a moment before asking, Has it been difficult? The recognition, I mean. Given that I'm Negro in a white man's navy? Jackson finished matter-of-factly. Yes and no. Some men can't see past the color of my skin, medal or no medal. Others judge me by what I've done, not what I look like. I've learned to focus on the latter. The first day of observation passed uneventfully, with only a few Japanese patrol boats passing through the strait. The second day brought more activity, with a convoy of supply barges moving south under escort by 2 patrol craft. Resupplying their garrisons on Rendova, most likely, Jackson observed as they recorded the details of the convoy. Should we radio this in? Morgan asked. Jackson considered briefly. No, not yet. These are just routine movements. We're looking for warships or troop transports that might indicate a major reinforcement effort. As dusk fell on their second day, the situation changed dramatically. Through his binoculars, Jackson spotted a column of warships entering the northern end of the strait. Morgan, he said urgently, prepare to transmit. I'm seeing what appears to be a Japanese task force entering the Blackett Strait. Morgan quickly prepared the radio as Jackson continued his observation, counting and identifying vessels as they came into view. 1 light cruiser, likely Tenryu class, 3 destroyers. And... wait. Jackson adjusted his binoculars, focusing intently on the vessels following the warships. Troop transports, 4 of them heavily loaded. This is a major reinforcement effort. Morgan had the radio ready. Message drafted, ready to transmit. Send it, Jackson ordered, continuing to observe the Japanese formation as it moved through the strait. Morgan sent the coded message to PT-109 and, through them, to Naval Headquarters at Tulagi. Within 20 minutes, they received an acknowledgement and new orders. Maintain observation and report any additional movements. A strike force was being assembled to intercept the Japanese task force. Throughout the night, Jackson and Morgan took turns observing and resting, though neither man slept much. The Japanese warships had anchored in a protected cove off New Georgia, clearly waiting for daylight before attempting to land their troops. Shortly before dawn, Jackson, who was on watch, noticed new movement in the strait. "Morgan," he whispered urgently, "we've got company." Morgan joined him at the observation point. "More Japanese?" "No," Jackson replied, a smile spreading across his face. "Ours, PT boats, at least 6 of them, approaching from the south." Through their binoculars, they watched as the American PT boats formed a loose attack formation and moved toward the Japanese anchorage. What followed was a textbook night attack. The PT boats approached at high speed, launched their torpedoes from multiple angles, then withdrew before the Japanese warships could effectively respond. The result was devastating. One destroyer was hit immediately, breaking in half and sinking within minutes. The light cruiser took at least 2 torpedo hits, listing heavily to port and clearly in danger of capsizing. One of the troop transports erupted in flames, illuminating the entire scene. "They caught them completely by surprise," Morgan observed, his voice tight with excitement. "Our intelligence made that possible," Jackson replied. "That's why we're here." As dawn broke, the remnants of the Japanese task force were in disarray. The light cruiser had managed to extinguish its fires, but remained heavily damaged. One destroyer was actively engaged in rescuing survivors from the sunken destroyer, while the other provided protection. 2 of the troop transports appeared undamaged and were retreating northward, escorted by the remaining operational destroyer. Jackson and Morgan continued to observe and report throughout the day as American aircraft from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal arrived to finish what the PT boats had begun. By nightfall, the Japanese reinforcement attempt had been completely thwarted, with significant losses in both ships and troops. PT-109 returned as scheduled on the 3rd night to retrieve Jackson and Morgan. "Your intelligence was pivotal," Winston informed them as they came aboard. "That Japanese force was carrying nearly 2,000 troops intended to reinforce the New Georgia garrison ahead of our invasion. If they had landed successfully, our casualties during the upcoming operation would have been significantly higher." "Just doing our job, sir," Jackson replied modestly. "Well, your job continues to make a difference," Winston said. "Which reminds me, there's something I need to discuss with you, Jackson." Later, as PT-109 headed back toward its base at Tulagi, Winston called Jackson to the tiny compartment that served as the boat's wardroom. "I've received new orders," Winston began without preamble. "I'm being transferred to Pearl Harbor to help establish a new PT boat training program. They want to incorporate the lessons we've learned here in the Solomons, particularly the Jackson method and other tactical innovations." Jackson nodded, though he felt a twinge of disappointment at the thought of losing his commanding officer. "Congratulations on the new assignment, sir. There's more," Winston continued. "I've been authorized to bring 1 petty officer with me as an instructor. I'd like that to be you, Jackson." Jackson blinked in surprise. "Me, sir?" "You're the obvious choice," Winston replied. "No one understands these techniques better than the man who developed them. Plus, you've demonstrated a natural ability to teach others." Jackson was silent for a long moment, considering the opportunity. Teaching at Pearl Harbor would mean relative safety, regular hours, and the chance to influence naval operations throughout the Pacific through his training efforts. Yet something held him back. "Sir, I'm honored by the offer," he said finally, "but I believe I can make a greater contribution here on active patrol. The men I've served with, the experiences we've shared, this is where I belong right now." Winston studied him thoughtfully. "I suspected you might say that, and I respect your decision." He paused, then added, "But know this. What you've accomplished here goes beyond just sinking enemy vessels or gathering intelligence. You've demonstrated something important about the true nature of service and capability." "Thank you, sir," Jackson replied quietly. "No, thank you, Jackson," Winston said. "I'll make sure your contribution is recognized in my reports, and I have a feeling we'll cross paths again before this war is over." As PT-109 continued its journey back to Tulagi, Jackson stood at the bow, looking out over the dark waters. He thought about the path that had brought him here, from the bayous of Louisiana to the Solomon Sea, from a fisherman following in his father's footsteps to a decorated petty officer in the United States Navy. The war would continue, with its triumphs and tragedies, its moments of heroism and horror. But something had changed, not just in the tactical approach to PT boat operations, but in the broader understanding of who could contribute and how. A simple wire loop, a technique born of necessity in the Louisiana bayous, had demonstrated that innovation could come from unexpected sources and that true capability transcended the artificial barriers of race and background. In the years following the war, the story of PT-109 and the Jackson method would become part of naval lore, taught in academies and recounted in books about the Pacific Campaign. More importantly, it would serve as one of many examples that would eventually help break down the walls of segregation in the United States military, culminating in President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948, which officially desegregated the armed forces. Leroy Jackson would go on to serve throughout the remainder of the Pacific Campaign, eventually rising to the rank of Chief Petty Officer before the war's end. After the war, using the GI Bill, he would attend Maritime Academy and become one of the first African-American officers in the United States Merchant Marine, commanding vessels that sailed the very oceans he had helped secure during the conflict. The Japanese destroyer sunk by Jackson's innovation represented more than just a tactical victory in a remote corner of the Pacific. It represented the beginning of a change in perception, a recognition that diversity of background and experience could translate directly to diversity of thinking, and that this diversity was not a weakness, but a profound strength. In 1975, during a naval reunion in San Diego, an elderly Leroy Jackson, by then long retired from the sea, was approached by a middle-aged man who introduced himself as the son of Thomas Jefferson Winston. "My father passed away last year," the younger Winston said, "but he spoke of you often." He said that night in the Ferguson Passage taught him the most important lesson of his naval career. "And what was that?" Jackson asked. "That the strength of a nation isn't found in its technology or even its tactics," Winston's son replied, "but in its ability to draw upon the full measure of talent and perspective from all its citizens, regardless of their background." Jackson nodded, the faint smile crossing his weathered face. "Your father was a good man and a fine officer. I learned as much from him as he ever did from me." As the reunion continued around them, the two men spoke for hours, sharing stories of the war and the changes that had come in its wake. The world had transformed in the decades since that night in the Solomon Islands, when a simple wire loop had changed the course of a battle, but the fundamental truth revealed in that moment remained constant. Innovation comes not from conformity, but from diversity, not from limitation, but from opportunity. And somewhere in the depths of the Ferguson Passage, the remains of a Japanese destroyer still rested on the seafloor, a silent testament to that enduring truth. As the decades passed, the story of Leroy Jackson and PT-109 became increasingly recognized as historians re-evaluated the contributions of African Americans during World War II. Naval academies included the Jackson method in their curriculum, not just as a tactical innovation, but as an example of how diverse backgrounds and experiences could provide unique solutions to military challenges. In 1993, 50 years after the events in the Solomon Islands, a special commemoration was held at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. A display was dedicated to innovative naval tactics developed during World War II, with a prominent section devoted to the wire loop technique that had sunk a Japanese destroyer. Present at the ceremony was 92-year-old Leroy Jackson, one of the last surviving members of PT-109's crew. Surrounded by admirals, historians, and naval cadets, the elderly veteran recounted the events of that April night in 1943. "I didn't do anything special," he told the assembled audience with characteristic modesty. "I just applied what I knew from a lifetime of fishing. The sea speaks its own language, and if you listen closely enough, it will tell you what you need to know." A young naval cadet raised her hand during the question and answer session. "Mr. Jackson, how did it feel to be recognized for your achievement at a time when the military was still segregated?" Jackson considered the question carefully before answering. "It was complicated. On one hand, receiving the Silver Star was an honor I never expected. On the other hand, I knew there were many other African-American sailors and soldiers doing remarkable things without recognition. I saw my medal not just as a personal achievement, but as a crack in a wall that needed to come down." Another cadet asked, What was the most important lesson you learned from your wartime experience? That's easy, Jackson replied with a smile. I learned that the most effective weapon in any conflict isn't a torpedo or a gun or even a wire loop. It's the human mind, particularly when it's free to draw on diverse experiences and perspectives. Uniformity of thought is a weakness. Diversity of thought is a strength. As the ceremony concluded, the Naval War College's president presented Jackson with a replica of the wire loop, mounted on a polished wooden base with a brass plaque commemorating his innovation. The elderly veteran accepted it with tears in his eyes, his thoughts clearly drifting back to those distant days in the Solomon Islands. Today, naval historians recognize the Jackson method as not just a tactical innovation, but as a symbolic moment that helped change perceptions about who could contribute to America's war effort and how. Military leadership programs around the world now emphasize the importance of diverse backgrounds and experiences in problem-solving and tactical innovation. And occasionally, fishing guides in the Louisiana bayous will tell visitors about a local man who once used a simple wire loop, the same kind they still use to secure their catches, to sink a Japanese destroyer halfway around the world. The story of how a black U.S. fisherman's wire loop sank a Japanese destroyer in 5 minutes is more than just a tale of wartime ingenuity. It's a testament to the principle that strength lies in diversity, that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, and that the full measure of a nation's potential can only be realized when every citizen has the opportunity to contribute their unique skills and perspectives. In the waters of the Solomon Islands, that principle was demonstrated with dramatic effect when a simple fishing technique from the Louisiana bayous changed the course of a naval engagement and, in its own small way, helped change the course of history itself. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.